The sword was in a glass case near the door of Mr. Farrow's shop, which smelled of beeswax and something older underneath. Something that had accumulated in velvet-lined drawers over many decades. Cecily Vane noticed it because of the pommel. She had been walking 2 steps behind Lady Anstruther, attending to the old woman's commentary on a pair of silver candlesticks, and then the glass case caught the gray November light from the street, and she stopped. The grip was wrapped in wire over dark wood, worn where a hand had held it many thousands of times. The guard was plain iron, etched at the edges with a pattern of interlocked rings, and the pommel was a brass cap, slightly domed, with a small seam running its circumference where cap met collar. She knew that seam. She had traced it with her fingertip when she was 7 years old, sitting on her father's knee in the library at Hartwick, and she had asked him what it was for. He had pressed her finger away gently. "Nothing, my dear. A flaw in the casting." She had not believed him then. She did not believe him now. Lady Anstruther had moved on to a display of miniature portraits. Cecily's heartbeat, which she considered an unreliable thing in the ordinary way, had become audible to her. She set her gloved fingers on the glass case and looked more carefully. The seam was not merely decorative. The brass cap was fitted, not cast as one piece with the collar beneath it. It could be removed. Something could be stored inside the hollow of a pommel, sealed by a cap that appeared to be only an ornament. "You are admiring the sword." The voice came from behind her, and she turned. The man standing in the doorway of Mr. Farrow's shop was tall and very still, in a dark coat that carried the cold of the street in its shoulders. He was perhaps a dozen years older than she was, with dark hair and the kind of face that had settled into its lines with considerable authority. The face of a man who had learned not to announce what he was thinking before he was ready. His eyes were a gray-brown she did not have a name for. He was looking at the sword, then at her, and something in his expression had gone careful in a way she could not read. "It is my father's sword," she said. She had not planned to say it. She said it because it was true, and she had stopped apologizing for true things 2 years ago. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know," he said. She did not understand at first what he meant. Then she did. The stillness that moved through her was not anger, not yet, because there was no room for it beside the shock. She looked at him fully, the way one takes in a landscape resolves into something one recognizes too late to have prepared for. "You are Sir Edmund Rayne," she said. "Yes." "You sold it." "Yes." He did not elaborate, and he did not look away. She appreciated neither of those things in the moment, though she would appreciate both of them later. Mr. Farrow appeared from behind his counter, a small man with bright eyes and the manner of someone who had navigated 30 years of people claiming ownership of things he had legally purchased. He looked between Cecily and Sir Edmund with professional composure. "May I be of assistance?" "The sword in the case," Sir Edmund said. "I should like to examine the hilt." "As would I," Cecily said. Mr. Farrow unlocked the case with a small key he wore on a chain at his waist. He set the sword on a cloth on the counter. The shop had gone quiet. Lady Anstruther had drifted to the doorway between the front room and the back gallery, and was watching with the alert interest of a woman who had survived 7 decades by paying attention to rooms when they changed. Cecily reached for the pommel. Sir Edmund reached for it at the same moment. His hand did not quite arrive before hers, and he stopped himself. And she was grateful, though she did not show it. The pommel cap was indeed fitted. She turned it counterclockwise, and it resisted, then yielded. One full turn, then another. The cap came free, inside the collar, A hollow, roughly the width of 3 fingers and 2 knuckles deep. Empty. The 3 of them looked at it. Mr. Farrow leaned in with the expression of a man who had not previously known there was a hollow in his merchandise. Sir Edmund's jaw had set into a line that carried everything he was not saying. Cecily looked into the hollow for a very long moment, then set the pommel cap carefully on the cloth beside the sword and said, "When did you acquire this?" 18 months ago, Mr. Farrow said. At auction, an estate lot from Rain Park. He glanced at Sir Edmund. I purchased 16 pieces in that lot. Was the sword locked in a case? Sir Edmund asked, or stored loosely? The swords were in a case. The case had a padlock. I had to have the padlock broken. Cecily looked at Sir Edmund. He was still looking at the sword. His hands, she noticed, were still at his sides, fingers slightly open, as though whatever he had come here expecting had not been what he found. She could not yet determine whether to trust any of it. The openness, the stillness, the fact that he had come here alone and quietly, not with a solicitor and a claim. The compartment has been opened before, she said. Not a question. Sir Edmund finally looked at her. Yes, he said. I believe it has. If you have been waiting for this story, the way I have been waiting to tell it, then stay close. There is more. There is quite a great deal more. Cecily Vane had grown up at Hartwick Hall in Wiltshire, on 1,200 acres of chalk downland and river meadow that her family had held since the reign of George II. She had not, as a child, troubled herself with the specific machinery of inheritance, because Hartwick had always simply been there, the way stone is there, and hills are there, unremarkable in its permanence. She had learned to ride in its paddocks, read in its library, and bury both her mother and her father in the small flint chapel on the east edge of the grounds. She had been 22 when her father died, and 22 and 3 months when Mr. Crane arrived at the door with a solicitor to explain the entail. The estate had descended under a general entail that bound it to the male line of the Vane family since 1790. There was no brother. There was no uncle. Cecily's nearest male relation was a second cousin, twice removed, named Silas Crane, who lived in Bristol and had visited Hartwick exactly once that she could recall, when she was 11, and who had admired the silver at table in a way that she had noted without understanding why. Mr. Crane had, it appeared, understood the entail in considerable detail for some years before he was required to act on it. She had not contested it at the time because she could not afford to contest it, and because contesting an entail in Chancery was the sort of project that consumed a decade and a fortune she did not possess. She had packed what she was permitted to take: her mother's miniature, her father's small library, a trunk of linen, and accepted the position Lady Anstruther had offered, companion to an elderly widow of fixed income and intermittently excellent company. She was paid £30 a year and occupied 2 rooms above the street in the ladies' Kensington house, and she was grateful for it in the way one is grateful for a ledge when one has been falling. She had not, however, stopped looking. Her father had told her, in the last weeks of his illness, that there was a document. He had been lucid, his voice the papery thing it became near the end, and he had said that the entail could be broken, Cecily. There is a deed of exception. Your grandfather commissioned it when the family was in dispute with the Hartley branch. It removes Hartwick from the general line and assigns it specifically to my issue, male or female. He had paused to breathe. Rain was keeping it. Rain Sr. He was the man your grandfather trusted. Rain Sr. had died 4 months before her father. Edmund Rain, who had inherited the baronetcy along with a set of debts his father had kept quiet for years, had sold Rain Park's movable effects in a lot sale within a year of succeeding to the title. He had done this without any apparent knowledge that one of the items in that lot contained a legal document that could restore the inheritance of a woman he had known, at a distance, for most of her life. She had not yet decided whether to believe that. After the shop, she had walked Lady Anstruther back to Kensington in the thin afternoon light. She had answered the lady's questions about the sword in as few words as she could, without discourtesy. She had eaten supper with the composure of someone who has learned to perform composure at table, regardless of what is occupying the mind. Then she had gone to her room, sat at the small desk below the window, and thought about the empty compartment for a very long time. Someone had opened it before Mr. Farrow purchased the sword in an estate lot. The sword had been at Rain Park. The men who had access to Rain Park before the lot sale were Sir Edmund and his household. The compartment's contents were gone. The question was not whether he had taken them. The question was whether he had taken them before or after he sold the sword. And the answer to that question determined everything that came next. She did not sleep until past 2 o'clock. And in the morning she sent a note. He called at 11, while Lady Anstruther was at her correspondence. Cecily received him in the front sitting room, where the fire was adequate and the light from the street was gray and honest. He came alone. He was without his hat, which he had handed to the footman. He sat when she indicated the chair across from hers, and he did not begin speaking, which told her something. Because men who have something to hide generally fill silence quickly. "You opened the hilt before you sold the sword," she said. "No," he said. "I did not know the hilt had a compartment. I did not know the sword was anything other than a cavalry piece that had belonged to my father. But your father knew." A pause. "Yes." "How do you know that?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone choosing the exact boundary of what he was prepared to say. His hands were flat on his knees. His coat was a dark blue, well made but some seasons old, the kind of garment worn by a man who has settled his expenditures to a particular discipline. "I found a letter," he said, "in my father's papers, which I had not finished reading until 6 months ago. There was a great deal of paper. He was not a man who discarded anything." He looked at his hands. "The letter was from your father, written in the year before his death, asking after the sword specifically, whether it had been kept safely, whether the hilt remained intact." His jaw tightened at the corner. My father's reply was drafted at the bottom of the letter in pencil. He intended to write it out clean and send it, but either he did not have time or he decided against it. The draft read, "The sword is well. Say nothing of the hilt to anyone. When the moment comes, I will bring it forward myself." Cecily looked at him. His face was composed in a way that the face becomes when composure has been deliberately constructed over something it would otherwise rather not contain. "He died before the moment came," she said. "Yes. And I sold the sword without knowing what was inside it. And the deed was still there then. Or so I believe it must have been. Or he would not have written that the hilt was intact." He paused. "What I do not know is when between the sale and Mr. Farrow's purchase, someone opened it and took what was inside." Crane, Cecily thought, who had known enough of the entail's details to prepare his claim in advance, who had perhaps known, through some channel she had not identified, that a deed of exception existed and that the Rain household was keeping it. She kept that thought to herself. She had learned in 2 years of uncertainty to keep her thoughts to herself until they were ready to be useful. "What do you propose to do?" she asked. Edmund looked up. He had very little expression on his face, But the little he had was, she thought, something close to relief, that she had asked it as a practical question, rather than an accusation. "Trace it," he said. "If the deed was removed from the Hilt before the lot sale, then someone at Rain Park took it. If it was removed afterward, then whoever purchased the sword before Mr. Farrow acquired it is the link." He paused. "I have spoken with Mr. Farrow about the auction records. There was one prior transaction. A gentleman purchased the sword from the estate lot directly and returned it to Farrow for resale 3 months later. He gave his name as a Mr. W. Knoll." Cecily was still for a moment. "That is not a real name," she said. "No," Edmund said. "I do not believe it is." She looked at him across the length of the sitting room. The fire had settled, and the room was quiet, and she was aware that she was making a decision she could not easily unmake, the way one is aware of weight shifting on a bridge. She did not entirely trust him yet. She was not certain she was wrong not to trust him. She needed what he knew, and he was clearly, for reasons he had not fully disclosed, pursuing the same thing she was. "We should speak with your father's steward," she said, "and with the auction house." "I had intended to do exactly that," he said. His voice was level. She noted that he did not add, "without you," and she noted that she had noticed. It was 2 weeks after the shop that Cecily went to Hartwick. She went on a Tuesday, when Lady Anstruther had a standing engagement with her daughter in Chelsea, and Cecily had the better part of the morning to herself. She hired a carriage as far as the village and walked the rest of the way, which was perhaps a 1.5 miles of lane lined with bare hawthorn. The ground was frozen in the ruts, and the sky was the color of pewter. She knew every turning. She had not permitted herself to come back before now. 2 years was long enough to make the decision deliberate rather than sentimental, and she was not a woman who permitted herself to mistake sentiment for resolve. She had returned today for a practical reason. As her father's grave was in the chapel on the east edge of the grounds, and Crane had extended a qualified permission for her to visit it during daylight hours, qualified by an expectation that she would give prior notice, which she had not given. The chapel was small and very old, built of the same gray flint as the boundary walls. The grave marker was a flat stone, unassuming, with her father's name and the dates and nothing else, because he had asked for nothing else. She had brought a bunch of dried honesty from the hedgerow, white papery discs still holding their silver. She laid them at the stone's edge and knelt on the cold ground and looked at his name. The stone had shifted in the frost. The right edge had tilted perhaps an inch. She took off her gloves and set them in her pocket and straightened it with both hands, pressing into the cold ground until it sat level. Her hands ached from it. She wiped them on her skirt and put her gloves back on and remained kneeling. "I am still looking," she said quietly. To the stone, to the frozen ground, to the gray air. "I have found the sword. The deed was taken. I do not yet know by whom. I am still looking." She was not aware she had been heard. She rose and walked back through the chapel gate without looking around, and the sound of the latch closing behind her was the only sound in the grounds. At the gate to the lane she stopped, because there was a man standing there. Edmund, in his dark coat, his hat in his hand. He had clearly not intended to be seen. His face, when she looked at it, was doing the careful thing it did when he did not wish her to read it. But she was beginning to learn the difference between the careful expression he wore when he was concealing something and the careful expression he wore when he was feeling something he had no right to feel. This was the second kind. He said nothing. She said nothing. She opened the gate and walked past him toward the lane, and he fell into step beside her at a proper distance, and they walked in silence for a full minute, before he said that he had come to speak with your father's former groom. He lives in the village now. He may know whether Crane or Crane's people came to Rain Park before the lot sale. Did he know? She said. He did not know of any specific visit, Edmund said. But he said that Crane wrote to my father twice in the months before his death. He did not know the subject of the letters. She absorbed this. The lane was narrow, and the hawthorn pressed in on either side, bare and very still. She was aware of him walking beside her in the way she had become generally aware of where he was in any given space, which was not something she encouraged, but had not found herself able to prevent. Your father told him, she said, or Crane found another way to learn of it. Either way, he knew the deed existed, and he knew where it was being kept. Yes, Edmund said. He was quiet for a moment. Cecily. Her given name, the first time he had used it, said as though he had been deciding for some time whether to. She looked at him. His jaw was at that set angle, but his eyes were doing the direct thing, looking at her without the careful overlay. I am sorry, he said, for what my family's silence cost you. I should have read my father's papers sooner. I should have searched more carefully. I should not have sold the Rain collection without examining it piece by piece. I did not know, but not knowing is its own category of failure, and I am not asking you to forgive it. She looked at him for a moment. A blackbird somewhere in the hawthorn began a phrase and abandoned it. I have not decided yet, she said, whether to forgive it. No, he said. I did not expect you to. She walked on. He kept pace. She noticed that she was glad of both things, which she thought was probably more information than she had asked for this morning. And she filed it in the part of herself where she kept things she intended to examine later. The letter was, in the end, the piece that unlocked it. Edmund had returned to Rain Park in the third week of November to search his father's papers a second time, more carefully, now that he knew what question he was trying to answer. He found 3 letters from Crane, dated over a period of 2 years before his father's death. The first was cordial and exploratory, the kind of letter a man writes when he is establishing a pretense of social connection. The second was more pointed, referencing a document that the writer had reason to believe was being held at Rain Park as a matter of informal trusteeship, suggesting that any such document, having been composed under conditions of family dispute, might be considered legally contested in a modern proceeding. The third was from 12 months after Edmund's father's death, addressed to the steward, asking whether the late baronet's effects had yet been inventoried. There was no written reply to any of them in his father's papers. His father had not answered, or had answered in person, or had answered in terms that were not preserved. What was preserved was the fact of the letters themselves, and the clear picture they assembled, that Crane had known about the deed for years, had probed at its existence with considerable deliberation, and had waited for the right moment to move. The right moment, as it had turned out, was the lot sale. Edmund sat with the letters for a very long time in his father's study, where the fire had gone low and the November dark had come in through the windows. He thought about a man who had let silence grow around a document that could have restored a young woman to her home, because breaking that silence would have required him to admit to 2 years of guilty delay. He thought about a 22-year-old who had packed her mother's miniature and her father's books into a trunk and walked out of the house she had grown up in to live in 2 rooms in Kensington on £30 a year, with the knowledge that somewhere the proof of her rightful ownership existed and no knowledge of where. He sat with all of that in the low firelight and did not permit himself to set it aside. He had written to Cecily that evening. He had told her about the letters. He had not told her what he intended to do about them, because he did not know yet, and he was not a man who made promises he could not keep. He had, however, known by the time he sealed the letter that he was not going to leave this where it stood. The document, or rather the certified copy of it, the original having been lodged, it would turn out, with a retired solicitor named Mr. Josiah Fenn, who had drawn it up for Cecily's grandfather in 1814 and kept a copy in his own records as a matter of professional habit, came to light in the 3rd week of December, in a manner so quiet as to be almost anticlimactic. Mr. Fenn was 72 years old, in good health, and possessed of an extremely well-organized filing system. He had heard, through the small channels by which professional men of the law hear things, that there was some question about a Vane estate deed, and he had been debating whether to come forward. And then Edmund's inquiry had arrived, and he had simply opened his file and read out the relevant contents over a cup of tea in his sitting room in Bath. This content was as follows: a deed of exception, executed by Sir Robert Vane in 1814, witnessed by 2 men whose signatures Mr. Fenn had affixed his own seal to, removing the estate of Hartwick Hall from the general entail of the Vane family in favor of the direct issue of Sir Robert's only son, issue being defined, the document specified in plain terms, as children of either sex. Cecily had gone white when Edmund read this to her. Then she had gone very still, the way she did when something was too large for her face to know what to do with. Mr. Fenn, who was the kind of man who had delivered a great deal of news over a long career and knew how to sit quietly with it, poured her more tea and said nothing for a moment. "Is it legally binding?" she asked when she had managed the stillness. "It is," Mr. Fenn said. "It was properly executed, properly witnessed, properly sealed. Mr. Crane's possession of Hartwick rests on the general entail of 1790. This document supersedes it." Edmund watched her. She was holding the cup of tea with both hands and looking at the document on the table. And her expression was the expression of someone who has been carrying a particular weight for so long that learning it will be lifted produces not relief, but a kind of trembling disbelief. "However," Mr. Fenn said, and Cecily's head came up. He set his teacup down with the precise care of a man who is about to say something he does not enjoy saying. "Mr. Crane may contest the copy. The original deed, as I understand it, has not been recovered." They looked at him. A copy, however faithfully preserved, is not the primary document, Mr. Fenn said. "In Chancery, a determined opponent with sufficient funds might argue that the copy is unverified, that the original was destroyed or was never correctly executed, or that the copy itself has been altered. These arguments would likely fail, but they would take time, and time in Chancery is measured in years." He paused. "I would not raise this as a counsel of despair. I raise it because you should know what you are facing if Mr. Crane chooses to fight." Cecily was quiet. Then she said, "He will fight it. He is not a man who concedes what he believes is legally his." "No," Edmund said. "He is not." He had met with Crane the previous week, at Crane's invitation, phrased so smoothly it was almost unrecognizable as the threat it contained. They had met at Crane's London house, in a dining room that had been furnished with particular attention to comfort, and Crane had offered him a glass of port and said, quite pleasantly, that he understood there was some old piece of family gossip being circulated about a document, and he hoped it would not lead to any misunderstanding that would trouble their friendship. And he was certain that a woman of Miss Vane's good sense would understand that a companion's circumstances, though modest, were perfectly respectable, and that pursuing a claim that even her father had not thought to bring forward in his lifetime was perhaps not the most dignified course of action for a young woman of her station. "She is a dispossessed daughter, with nothing left to contest," Crane had said, in the tone of a man who considers himself kind for saying it. "The law is clear. I have the estate. I have the documentation. What she has is a family story." Edmund had said very evenly that he appreciated the port. He had left without another word. He had driven back through the London dark thinking about that phrase, "nothing left to contest," and about Cecily kneeling on frozen ground beside her father's grave, pressing the tilted stone level with her bare hands. He had gone to see Mr. Fenn the following morning. It was Crane's man of business who delivered the final cruelty, though he delivered it in the accidental way that instruments of cruelty often do, without quite knowing what they carry. He met with Mr. Fenn a fortnight after the discovery, at Mr. Fenn's offices in Bath, to inform the solicitor that Mr. Crane was prepared to contest the copy's authenticity, and that he had already retained counsel, and was, the man said with the smooth confidence of someone who has had this conversation before, preparing to demonstrate that the document had been fabricated in recent months to advance a frivolous claim. Fabricated. Mr. Fenn, who had drawn up the original deed himself in 1814, heard this with the expression of a man presented with an insult so arresting it required a moment to process. He did not respond to it in the meeting. He sent his clerk to inform Edmund afterward. Cecily was with Lady Anstruther when Edmund called that afternoon, and she heard from the front hall the quality of his voice when he spoke to the footman, and she excused herself from the lady's company with a brief word, and went out. He told her standing in the front hall, in his coat, still holding his hat, because he had not been willing to sit down with it for the length of a drawing-room. He told her plainly. Crane intended to call the copy a forgery. It would not succeed. Fenn's records were extensive and entirely genuine. Succeeding was not Crane's primary objective. Delay was. A chancery suit could drag for 3 years, 4 more. She stood in the front hall of Lady Anstruther's house and listened. Her face was doing the thing it did when something hit harder than she had prepared for. Then she was quiet for a moment. She said, "There is a dinner. Mr. Crane is hosting it, Thursday next, at Hartwick. It is the dinner he holds every December to mark the estate's transfer, a thing he has done each year since he took possession. He invites the neighborhood. He makes a small speech. He is very fond of the speech." Edmund looked at her. He understood what she was saying. "Fenn must be there," she said. "I will ask him," Edmund said. "He is a gentleman of 72. He may object to the cold and the distance." "He will come," Cecily said. "I think he has wanted to come to something like this for a long time." She was right about Mr. Fenn. She was, Edmund was discovering, very often right. The dinner at Hartwick was held on a Thursday in mid-December, in the dining room that Cecily had last sat in as a child, eating syllabub on a winter evening with her father, and the sound of the fire behind her. The room was the same, long table and plasterwork ceiling and portraits. The plasterwork ceiling, the portraits that Crane had not replaced but had moved to make room for a large looking-glass. 40 guests were seated. The wine was good. The soup was good. Everything about Crane's Hartwick dinner was good in the way of a man who has sufficient income to ensure the goodness of all things, and sufficient confidence in that income to assume it will continue. Edmund was seated near the far end of the table. Cecily was not there. She had not been invited, which was itself a piece of information about the way his confidence organized itself. Mr. Josiah Fenn was there, because Edmund had brought him as his particular guest, and Mr. Fenn had dressed with the quiet formality of a man who understood the occasion perfectly. Miss Octavia Crane was seated 2 places from Edmund, in a gown the color of deep cream. She was a handsome woman with a composed expression and the practiced social ease of someone who had spent her life in the orbit of a man who expected a great deal from rooms. She had said several agreeable things to Edmund over the fish course, which he had received with the civil brevity he reserved for conversations that required civility but not engagement. After the fish, Crane rose to speak. He did this with the ease of long practice, standing at the head of the table with the particular comfort of a man in a room that is entirely his. He spoke about the estate's improvement under his management, about the investments he had made in the tenants' cottages, about the drainage work he had commissioned in the East Meadow. He was not inaccurate. He had done those things. Edmund listened to all of it. Then Crane mentioned the legal matter. He mentioned it briefly, with the careful phrasing of someone who has prepared the phrasing in advance, a frivolous claim being brought by certain parties, a claim without evidentiary basis, a claim that any court would dismiss in the fullness of time as the nuisance it was. The table received this with the murmur of assembled guests who are not entirely certain whether they are expected to respond or simply to absorb. It was into this murmur that Edmund stood. He did not move toward the head of the table. He stood where he was, at the far end, and the room went quiet. Because rooms go quiet when a man stands up during a dinner speech. And he allowed the quiet to settle before he spoke. "I have brought a guest this evening," he said. "Mr. Josiah Fenn, who was for 40 years the most respected solicitor in Bath. Mr. Fenn drew up a deed of exception for the Vane family in 1814. He has kept a certified copy in his files for 42 years. He has brought the copy with him this evening." He nodded to Mr. Fenn, who set his hand on the interior pocket of his coat. Every head at the table turned. Crane's face had stiffened. The comfortable authority of it was still present. But underneath, something had gone calculating. "This is most irregular," he said. "Mr. Crane," Edmund said, "you told a colleague last month that the copy was a fabrication produced in recent months. Mr. Fenn's copy was produced in 1814. I believe he is prepared to speak to that, if anyone at this table would like to hear it." The room was very quiet. Crane's man of business, who was seated along the wall, had gone pale. Octavia Crane, 2 places from Edmund, had stilled her fan in her lap with the controlled precision of a woman who is processing something at high speed. Crane said, "A copy is not the original document." "No," Edmund said. "The original was kept in the hilt of a sword held in trust by my family. That sword was sold from my estate. I accept responsibility for that sale." He paused. He let that sit for a moment. "However, the original document's absence is explained by the records of your own correspondence with my late father. Letters in which you inquired about that sword specifically. Letters in which you referenced, with considerable clarity, your awareness of what the hilt contained." He looked at Crane. "I have those letters, Mr. Crane." The silence after this was of a specific, costly kind. The kind in which people understand that what has just been said cannot be unsaid, and that the room has irrevocably changed shape. Silas Crane sat down. He sat down not because he had been defeated quite yet, but because standing was suddenly requiring more from him than he had to offer. Edmund looked around the table. His voice was level and quiet. "The deed is hers," he said, "and so, if she will have me, is Hartwick." No one spoke. Somewhere in the dining room a candle popped. Lady Harriet Raine, who was seated near the middle of the table, and who had come this evening expecting something different from the evening she was now in, set down her wine-glass with a small, precise sound and looked at her hands. The evening ended in the way such evenings end, not in any single act, but in the slow accumulation of departures, conversations in the hall, the sound of carriages. Mr. Fenn was met by Crane's solicitor in the entry, and the conversation that followed was long and technical, and ended, by all accounts, in an agreement that no chancery filing would be made. Crane did not come to say good night to his guests. Octavia Crane did come, with a composure that deserved some credit, and shook Edmund's hand and said that she wished him joy, and he believed her, or believed at least that she would come to mean it. Lady Harriet found Edmund by the coat-room, in the moving crowd of departing guests. She was a tall woman who had always carried herself as though she expected rooms to adjust to her, and she was carrying herself the same way now, though the set of her jaw had changed. "I knew," she said, "about the compartment. Your father told me after he died, in a letter he left in case I needed to act on it. He did not tell you, because he intended to handle it himself." She paused. "When you sold the collection, I should have spoken. I did not. I told myself someone else would come forward, and then I told myself the opportunity had passed, and then I found reasons." She stopped. Edmund looked at her for a moment. He was not ready to forgive it in its full dimensions, and he did not pretend to be. "You will write to Miss Vane," he said. "A full account. She deserves to know." "Yes," Lady Harriet said. "I will." He left Hartwick that night and drove to Kensington in the dark and sent a note up to Cecily's rooms that said only that Fenn had spoken. Crane sat down. "Come to Hartwick when you are ready. It is yours." Cecily went to Hartwick the following Tuesday, in the early morning, when the winter light was thin and precise. The carriage set her down at the gate, and she walked up the avenue between the bare limes, her breath visible in the cold air, her hands in her gloves. The house was the same. She had prepared herself for the sight of it to do something to her, and it did, a great deal, and she had prepared herself for that, too. Edmund was waiting in the library. He was standing at the window when she came in, with his back to the room, looking out at the winter garden. The library smelled the same as it always had. Old paper, beeswax, a faint cold from the windows. Her father's books were gone from their shelves, but the shelves themselves were the same, and the fireplace was the same, and the morning light came through the same glass. She set her things down. Edmund turned. Between them, on the library desk, he had placed the brass pommel cap from the sword. He had asked Mr. Farrow for it after the dinner, and Farrow had given it willingly, with the air of a man relieved to have the matter concluded. She crossed to the desk and picked it up. It was cold in her palm, the weight of it more than she expected, though she had held it before. The slight dome of it, the seam where it fitted the collar. A flaw in the casting, her father had said, when she was 7 and pressing her fingertip into that seam. A flaw in the casting. She closed her hand around it. "I have not decided," she said, "about forgiving it." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I did not expect you had." She looked at him. He was looking at her in the direct way, the way without the careful overlay, the way she had begun to recognize as the face he offered when he had decided not to protect himself from whatever she was going to say. "I am not angry at you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I was angry for a time in November. I am not angry now. What you did without knowledge. And what you have done since, you have done with considerable cost to yourself, and I am not unaware of the cost." "I am not asking you to account for it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is part of what I am trying to tell you." He understood, she thought. He was not a man who required things spelled out plainly more than once. They stood in the library of Hartwick Hall, in the thin winter light, with the brass pommel cap in her right hand, and the fire beginning behind them. and it was not a grand moment. It was a quiet one. It was the kind of moment that does not announce itself, that arrives simply and waits to be noticed. And she noticed it, and she thought that perhaps that was enough for now, and that the rest could come at its own pace. What she did not yet know was that the pace would be, on balance, rather swift. He was not a man who, having determined what he wanted, lingered over the determination. By Christmas, there was an understanding between them that required no announcement to make it clear to anyone in the neighborhood who observed them. By the following spring, there was an announcement, formal and properly made, and Mr. Fenn attended the small gathering in the Hartwick drawing-room, where it was read out and smiled the smile of a man who has lived long enough to see the right ending find its way to the right story. That evening, after the guests had gone, Cecily sat in the chair by the library fire. The pommel cap was on the mantelpiece where she had put it the first morning, and she had not moved it since. The fire crackled softly. Edmund was reading in the chair opposite, turned a little toward the light, his dark profile against the warm glow of the hearth. She looked at the pommel cap. A flaw in the casting, her father had said. She had not believed him then. She did not believe him now. He had put it there on purpose, the flaw, the hollow, the document tucked inside and sealed against uncertainty, the way one plants a small, careful thing in the ground and trusts the season to bring it forward. Outside, the first snow of the year was beginning to fall. She watched it move past the window in the firelight. Quiet and ordinary and exactly right. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. Your favorite moment, or simply that you were here. She did not know you were watching either. You were. And that, in the end, made all the difference.